Hello, and thank you for joining us today. And happy Mother's Day to you, because today is Mother's Day. So I wanted to talk to you briefly about great mothers in the Bible who believe God. Now, if you're a male, or if you're not a mother and you're watching this, don't turn it off, because what I'm about to say is going to apply to everyone, not just to mothers. But since this is Mother's Day, we want to especially honor mothers and kind of use that as a theme. But what I want to say today, you'll find very useful and helpful and hopefully applicable in your life as well. Now, when it comes to the question of what makes a great mother, the answer is the same as what makes anyone great, or what commends anyone in the eyes of God. And I'm going to read to you from John's Gospel in chapter 6:28, chapter 6, verse 28 and 29. Jesus had just fed a big multitude, and they followed him the next day, expecting to be fed again. And Jesus had a little conversation with them. And they said to Jesus, the people in the crowd that day, "What shall we do that we might work the works of God?" And Jesus answered them and said, "This is the work of God, that you believe on the one whom he has sent." Back in the days of the Reformation in the late Middle Ages, when Martin Luther began to emphasize faith, that the most important thing for us to do as human beings is to believe God. And he based that, of course, on what he read in the Scriptures. The response from those who did not agree with him was that, by emphasizing faith, then you're diminishing the importance of good works. And so Martin Luther had a lot to say about good works, or what makes a work good. And he used the verse that I just finished reading to you to demonstrate that what makes a work good, or what makes anything good in the sight of God, or commendable in the sight of God, is faith. When these people in John chapter 6 asked Jesus, "What shall we do that we might work the works of God?" The Amplified Translation says, "What is it that God requires? What shall we do that we might carry out what God requires?" Or in other words, what's God looking for out of us? And Jesus said, this is what God's looking for. This is the work of God, that you believe on the one whom he has sent. And so Martin Luther's answer to those who criticized him was, whatever is done out of a heart of faith is good. It doesn't have to be some great thing. He used the example of a woman cleaning her house while she's sweeping the floor. If she believes God and her heart is right with God, then that is a good work. Every work is good if your heart is good. And so this is actually what we find in the Scripture about mothers. The greatest mothers of the Bible are those who believed God. And there's some really interesting and practical things here that we can discover. Now, here's something from Hebrews chapter 11, verse 11. You know, in Hebrews chapter 11, what it's all about is the so-called heroes of faith, characters in the Old Testament who the writer to the Hebrews tells us believed God, and that was the thing that made them special. It wasn't what they did, it was what they believed. And the things that they did that are recorded in the Old Testament are important or special because they are done by their faith. They acted on their faith. And so the writer to the Hebrews is going through the long list of all the big figures from the Old Testament, saying what was really important about them is that they believed what God said to them. And here we come to Sarah, who is the wife of Abraham, and here's what it says. Through faith, also, Sarah herself received strength to conceive seed, and was delivered of a child when she was past age, because she judged him faithful who had promised. Now, I think that's a really important expression, a really important phrase. She judged him faithful who promised. You know, one way you could define faith is just that, to judge him faithful who promised. You know, this relationship that we have with God, Christianity, or whatever label you want to put on it, it's not your idea, it's not my idea, it's his idea. He's the one who made promises. And what faith is merely a positive response to God's grace. merely a positive response to God's promises. And here it says, it uses Sarah as an example, the wife of Abraham. It says she believed him faithful. She judged him faithful who had promised. He promised, and she just judged that the one who promised is big enough to carry it out. Now, since we're talking about Sarah, and that she judged him faithful who promised, let me just read to you the story of Sarah that this is talking about, and I think we can make some interesting observations about it. This is in Genesis chapter 18, verses 1 through 15. And the Lord appeared to Abraham in the plains of Mamre, and he sat down in the tent door in the heat of the day, and he lifted up his eyes and looked, and lo, 3 men stood by him. And when he saw them, he ran to meet them from the tent door, and bowed himself down to the ground, and said, My Lord, if I have found favor in thy sight, pass not away, I pray thee, from thy servant. Let a little water, I pray you, be fetched, and wash your feet, and rest yourselves under the tree. And I will fetch a morsel of bread, and comfort ye your hearts, and then you shall pass on. For therefore are you come to your servant. And they said, So do as thou hast said. And Abraham hastened into the tent unto Sarah, and said, Make ready quickly 3 measures of fine meal, knead it, and make cakes upon the hearth. And let me turn the page. And Abraham ran unto the herd, and fetched a calf, tender and good, and gave it unto a young man, and he hasted to dress it. And he took butter and milk, and the calf which he had dressed, and set it before them. And he stood by them under the tree, and they did eat. And they said unto him, Where is Sarah thy wife? And he said, Behold, in the tent. And he said, I will certainly return unto thee according to the time of life, and lo, Sarah thy wife shall have a son. And Sarah heard it in the tent door, which was behind him. Now Abraham and Sarah were old, and well stricken in age, and it ceased to be with Sarah after the manner of women. Therefore Sarah laughed within herself, saying, After I am waxed old, shall I have pleasure, my Lord being old also? And the Lord said unto Abraham, Wherefore did Sarah laugh, saying, Shall I of a surety bear a child, which am old? Is anything too hard for the Lord? At the time appointed I will return unto thee according to the time of life, and Sarah will have a son. Then Sarah denied, saying, I laughed not, for she was afraid. And he said, Nay, but thou didst laugh. Now, first of all, it's kind of funny, this little episode at the end where Abraham laughed at the promise of God. Now, think about this. Now, granted, according to the context of this story, it's not exactly clear that Abraham perceived that these were supernatural entities, or that that these were angels, or whatever the case may be, spokesmen for God. But it became clear as they began to speak, and Sarah's initial response was to laugh at God's promise. That's how unlikely it seemed to her. God's promises don't necessarily have to seem logical or even plausible. And sometimes, like Sarah, when we may, if Sarah's laughing about it, she in her mind thought it was too late for her. Too much time had gone by. We're very time conscious, but God doesn't seem to be time conscious. So the first observation I can make about this is things that seem impossible to us are not impossible with God. Things that seem impossible to us are possible with God. This angel said, is anything too hard for the Lord? And that's a good question. Is anything? No. The answer is no. So nothing is too hard for God. And you can apply that to your life as well. Every one of us in our lives, we have things that we desire, things that we hope for, things that we would like to see. And you should apply this expression to that. Is anything too hard for God? Oh, no, nothing is too hard for God. Sarah herself laughed because it seemed so unlikely. So much time had gone by and she was so old. It says in the text, it ceased to be with her after the manner of women. But here came this angel with a promise which spoke directly to the biggest need and biggest desire in her heart. And, we're told in Hebrews that Sarah believed God, or that through faith Sarah received strength. Now this is a kind of a strange kind of faith here. I almost said it's a funny kind of faith because it's funny because she laughed at it. That's another observation I'll make here. Sometimes we get so wrought up and tense about it, thinking that with if we have any flaws at all, or if we make any mistakes at all, or if we don't say it just right, or if we don't stand just right, or if we ever have any doubts, or if we ever have any failings at all, then that sort of countermands or undoes or makes God's promise, it sort of nullifies things. But that's not the case at all. Here Sarah laughed right in the face of this messenger of God. And then when he said, "Why did you laugh?" she said, No, I didn't laugh. He said, "No, you did laugh." And so there's this kind of awkward exchange where she's saying, "No, I didn't." He said, "Yes, you did." "No, I didn't." "Yes, you did." But she did. The text tells us that she did. But she was afraid, she said. But you know what? Just because Sarah was not perfect, just because she laughed at the promise of God, it didn't nullify God's promise. God's promise was still there. And even though she laughed, she believed it. Through faith, she received strength to conceive. And the third thing I will observe from this, number one is nothing's too hard for God. Number two is, even if we're not perfect, that doesn't do away with God's promise. Number three is, with God, there's sometimes on our part, we live in a realm of time. And so sometimes there's a time factor involved. This messenger from God said to her at the appointed time, "I will return and you'll have a son." You might say, well, why didn't he just wave a magic wand and poof, a baby appear? Well, that's not the way things work in this physical world. Things sometimes take time. And what do we do in the meantime? What do we do while things are taking time? Well, we keep believing God. And even if we're not perfect, and even if we get discouraged, and even if we, I tend to think Sarah laughed in a kind of a cynical way. That's how unlikely this all seemed. None of that mattered. None of that matters. You know what matters? That God has promised. God has said some things. And when you embrace it and choose to believe it, it's just like what Jesus said. This is the work of God, that you believe on the one whom he has sent. So Sarah is a good example of someone who believed God and then saw the fulfillment of what God had promised. The best example, perhaps, of a mother who believed God is the case of Mary, the mother of Jesus. And again, the emphasis in the story of Mary and her conception is all on faith. And let me read it to you and draw some conclusions here. In the 6th month, the angel Gabriel was sent from God unto a city of Galilee, named Nazareth, to a virgin, espoused to a man whose name was Joseph of the house of David, and the virgin's name was Mary. And the angel came to her and said, Hail, thou art highly favored, and the Lord is with thee. Blessed art thou among women. And when she saw him, she was troubled at his saying, and cast in her mind what manner of salutation this might be. This is polite King James language, 400-year-old language. When it says she cast in her mind what manner of salutation this might be, that's like saying she wondered, who comes up to you on the street and says something like this? What kind of an introduction is that? It's very unusual and strange. And she was troubled, it says, or, it worried her, it concerned her. And the angel said to her, Fear not, Mary, for thou hast found favor with God. Now, I've said this before, and let me just stop and say it again. Whenever a messenger from God appears on the scene where humans are involved, the first thing he says is, Fear not, or don't be afraid. I think in our lives we have different circumstances than the people we're reading about here in the Bible, like Mary, for instance. There are different details to our lives, different things that are going on in our lives. But if a messenger from God, if you could see him, if you could perceive him, if you could hear what he was saying, he would say the same thing to you. Don't be afraid. Fear not. God is with you. The same thing that's true about Mary here is true for you and me as well. The angel said, "Fear not, Mary, for you have found favor with God. And behold, you shall conceive in your womb and bring forth a son, and you shall call his name Jesus. And he shall be great, and shall be called the Son of the Highest. And the Lord shall give unto him the throne of his father David. And he shall reign over the house of Jacob forever. And of his kingdom there shall be no end." And Mary said to the angel, "How shall this be, seeing I know not a man?" And the angel answered and said unto her, "The Holy Ghost shall come upon thee, and the power of the Highest shall overshadow thee. And therefore also that holy thing which shall be born of thee shall be called the Son of God. And behold, thy cousin Elizabeth, she hath also conceived a son in her old age. And this is the 6th month with her, who was called barren." Now listen to this in this verse 37. "For with God nothing shall be impossible." Now doesn't this remind you, by the way, of what we read about Sarah? God came to her, a very similar story, a woman who did not have a child and was not able to bear children. And when she laughed about it, he said, "Nothing's too hard for God. What are you laughing about?" And here, Mary also had some doubts about it. In her case, she wasn't too old, but she was not married at that time. And so the angel says, nothing's impossible with God. You know, we tend to be very short-sighted sometimes, or have a very narrow view of things based on our experience, but nothing's impossible with God. None of the objections that we might bring up, none of those things matter. God is able to do anything. Nothing's impossible with him. And so Mary said, "Behold, the handmaid of the Lord. Be it unto me according to thy word." It's a very important and powerful response. Be it unto me according to thy word. You see, he's the one who's made the promises. And this is another example of what faith is. Faith is saying, be it unto me according to thy word. Let it be true to me what you have said. Like we read about Sarah, she judged him faithful who had promised. See, the promises are all on his part. The power to carry out the promises are all on his part. We have a very simple role in this, and a very small role, but it's important, and that is to judge him faithful. The one who promised, he's got to do it. And what do? We believe him, and we trust him, and he does the work. Mary said, "Behold, the handmaiden of the Lord, be it unto me according to thy word." And the angel departed. And Mary arose in those days and went into the hill country with haste, and into a city of Judah, and entered into the house of Zacharias, and saluted Elizabeth. And it came to pass, when Elizabeth heard the salutation of Mary, the babe leaped within her womb, and Elizabeth was filled with the Holy Ghost, and spoke out with a loud voice, saying, "Blessed art thou among women, and blessed is the fruit of thy womb. And whence is this to me, that the mother of my Lord should come unto me? For lo, as soon as the voice of thy salutation sounded in mine ears, the babe leaped in my womb for joy." She, of course, was carrying the baby that grew to be the man that we call John the Baptist. And this next verse is very important. "And blessed is she that believed, for there shall be a performance of those things which were told her of the Lord, from the Lord." Blessed is she that believed, for there shall be a performance. You know, the same thing is true of all of us. You're blessed when you believe, because there will be a performance of those things that are told you from the Lord. Now, before we make further application of this, let's just make a few observations about this story. First of all, as we've read for the second time now, nothing is impossible with God. Nothing is beyond his ability to carry it out. The second thing I would observe from this, we've already mentioned, faith is merely our positive response to God's grace, to God's promise. Sarah judged him faithful who had promised. Mary said, "Be it unto me according to thy word." Faith is merely judging that the same one that promised is big enough to carry it out, and trusting Him to actually do that. And number three, again, we see there is a time factor involved when God is working in our lives. Now, we understand, of course, that God is a spirit, and in the realm of the spirit, there's no such thing as time. How do you know that? Well, again and again, we hear language associated with God and spiritual things, like eternal life, for instance, and eternity. Eternity is just another way of saying there's no time. Time's not a factor. But we're not spirits floating around in the ether, and we're not in heaven right now where there's no time. We're on earth where time is a factor. So when God is at work in our lives and at work carrying out what He promised to us and bringing to us the things that are our desire, like for Sarah, for instance, I'm sure that the foremost and the most prominent desire of her heart was to have a child, because she was not able to throughout her life. And she had even come to the point that she felt like enough time had gone by that she was giving up, and had given up hope on it. That's why she laughed when she heard the promise. I'll come back next year and you'll have a child. And she laughed about it. But you see, nothing's too hard for God, but there's a time factor involved. God is working, and what I started to say was that was what she most desired, I'm sure, in her life. And God knows about that and cares about that, just like He knows about you and me as well, and cares about the things that concern us, and He's at work in our lives. But there's time involved, and it requires us to keep believing and to not give up on our faith while God is working. Now, in terms of this time element, let me refer to Abraham just for a moment. I know we're talking about the great mothers who believe, but let's just talk about Abraham, because there's a great verse here I want to bring to your attention. This is in Romans chapter 4, verse 18. It says that Abraham, of course, Abraham is the husband of Sarah, and he wanted a son just as much as she did. And so he had to believe God as well. And again, when the promise was first given, there was some time that elapsed before they saw the result. And so what went on during that time? Romans chapter 4, verse 18 says, "Who against hope believed in hope, that he might become the father of many nations, according to that which was spoken, so shall thy seed be." That's what God's promise to him was. You will be, Abraham, the father of many nations. Now, just like Sarah, he was too old. Too much time had gone by. And he could have said, well, it's the same as her. He could have laughed about it and just said, well, how can that possibly be the case? But it says here that who against hope believed in hope. What does that mean? Well, I love what the Message says. Let me read it to you. Abraham had this promise from God, and time has gone by since the promise of God. Didn't seem like anything was happening. And here's what the Message says. When everything was hopeless, Abraham believed anyway, deciding to live not on the basis of what he saw he couldn't do, but on the basis of what God said he would do. Well, I think that's great. I like what it says here, that when everything seemed hopeless, Abraham believed anyway. That's a good motto for us. Even if things don't seem to be moving, even if you don't see God working. And by the way, why did you ever expect that you would see an invisible God working in the invisible realm? But I promise you that He is. He works in ways that we cannot see. We are not aware of His workings. We're not aware of it and conscious of it until the physical manifestation comes into being. And I'm going to read that to you one more time because it's so good. When everything was hopeless, Abraham believed anyway. You see, that's what we should do. If things seem hopeless, we'll believe anyway. And I like the last part of this verse too. Abraham decided to live not on the basis of what he saw he couldn't do, but on the basis of what God said he would do. So, finally, in the story about Mary, the mother of Jesus, it said, "Blessed is she who believed, for there shall be a performance of those things that were told her by the Lord." Same thing is true about every one of us, about you and me as well. Well, you might say, well, Sarah and Abraham and Mary, they had direct promises from God. Well, you've got a whole book of promises from God. And let me just bring a couple of those to your attention. This is in Psalm chapter 37, verse 4. It says, "Delight thyself in the Lord, and he shall give thee the desires of thy heart." Now, I think that's a good verse because every one of us is different as individuals. But you know, every one of us, we have hopes and we have desires and we have things that we'd like to see. God's aware of those things. And this psalm tells us that he not only knows what the desires of your heart are, but it says, delight yourself in the Lord and he'll give you the desires of your heart. Or in other words, put your faith and your affection and your attention on the Lord and he'll give you the desires of your heart. You know, Jesus brought up the same thing. And let me quote to you this verse. This is in Mark chapter 11, verse 24. Jesus said, "What things soever you desire, when you pray, believe you receive them, and you shall have them." Saying again, pretty much the same thing that this psalm said. Well, there are things that we are looking for, things that we desire, just like Sarah desiring a child. And the thing about it is God already knows, and when you pray about those things, you might not feel like God even heard you. You might not feel like anything's happening, but things are happening. And you have to be like Abraham. And when everything seems hopeless, believe God anyway. You know, again, let's apply this, what we read in this story. At the appointed time, you will see what was promised. At the appointed time, I will return and Sarah will have a child. Again, the words of Elizabeth to Mary, she said, "Blessed is she who believed, for there shall be a performance of those things that were told her by the Lord." And I'd like to suggest to you that the same thing is true of you as well. You are blessed when you believe, even if, like Abraham, when things don't seem practical or plausible, even if you might be tempted to laugh about it like Sarah did. There's a blessing involved in believing, even when it doesn't seem likely. And the promise is there shall be a performance of those things that were told you by the Lord. Well, have a great Mother's Day, and I hope you found that encouraging. And next week we will hopefully be back to regular services with the appropriate precautions. And thank you for watching, and we'll see you again next time.